We're coming on the air with new developments around whether the world's top male tennis player could be booted from Australia because he's unvaccinated. Novak Djokovic, now the biggest face in the global showdown between people opposed to the shots and government mandates. We've got new reaction from the tennis world, plus some COVID news you can use about tests right here in the U.S. And right as we were coming on the air, two men accused of helping orchestrate the January 6th riot. We've just found out they're going to be behind bars for at least another week. We're going to take you live to the courtroom. Plus, it's winter, it's cold, and this weekend, for 50 million of you, it could be dangerous. We'll get the forecast that has some states down south declaring a state of emergency. And South Dakota's Republican governor fanning the flames of culture wars with a nationwide ad going after trans female athletes. One student saying the video is a sign she's, quote, not welcome here. We've got more in tonight's original. And the pandemic's changed a lot about how we watch the entertainment we love. But even with COVID still out there, studios want you back in theaters, not just on your couch. Wait till you see what's coming up with your box office preview. And we'll talk about that big premiere tonight. You probably know the one I mean. Hey, I'm Hallie. And as we come on the air, we could learn any moment that Novak Djokovic, the world's #1 tennis player, is in border control custody in Australia. All of this is happening as we're coming on the air ahead of a court hearing Sunday that will decide whether the unvaccinated star gets to play in the first Grand Slam event of the year or if he goes home. We learned earlier today an immigration minister revoked his visa a second time, saying that decision was in the public interest. So his team appealed again. We are now waiting for the Sunday hearing. Remember when Djokovic got to Australia last week? He was detained because of some mistakes in his visa. After some back and forth in court, he got that visa back, but the government wasn't having it and then pulled the visa again. You following all this? It's a saga that's really put a spotlight on what many see as one guy who got special treatment because he's a big deal at a time when COVID cases are going up around the world. And it's definitely putting a damper on this big tournament. Fellow tennis player Andy Murray saying today he just wants to see this whole thing resolved.
It just seems like it's dragged on for quite a long time now, and yeah, not great for the tennis, not great for the Australian Open, not great for Novak.
Keir Simmons has been following all of this for us. Keir, it's good to have you on. So listen, we heard Djokovic was supposed to be meeting with the Australian Border Force like about an hour ago on all this. We haven't heard anything yet. I know this was kind of being a little bit more secretive to prevent a media spectacle, but boy, it's already a media spectacle, right? What are we hearing? Anything yet?
It sure is, Hallie. Hey, great to lead the show. Long-time listener, first-time caller, and I bet, I feel better tonight than Novak Djokovic does because, well, if things have gone to time, it's 10 p.m. here in London. There in Australia, you can see the stadium behind me. It is 9 in the morning, and that means Novak Djokovic is already in custody with immigration officials. There's that hearing on Sunday. I mean, it's so tense, so tight, isn't it? It's like a tennis tiebreak. He's going to have that hearing on Sunday, and then his first match is on Monday, if he gets to play, which honestly right now seems pretty unlikely. I mean, his legal team describing the whole thing as patently irrational, but the Australian Prime Minister weighing in, saying Australians have made many sacrifices during this pandemic. They rightly expect the result of those sacrifices to be protected. So, Hallie, if you don't like your sport with a side of politics, look away now.
Let's talk about the consequences here, right? Because not only could Djokovic be deported, like almost right away, he might not be allowed back into Australia for 3 years. I talked with Mary Carrillo, who I know fans of this network know, right? Tennis analyst. She's telling me that's not good for his career. This is a guy who wins at the Australian Open. That's what he's known for, among many things.
Exactly. This is a guy who is used to winning on the court and is now having to fight for his career in court. If he does get banned for 3 years, it's tough. The Australian Open is a big one for him. He's won again and again and again. He's right on the cusp of being the most successful men's tennis player in history, but his age, he's on the edge, I guess you could say, of kind of not being able to win so easily. So it's really tough. I thought Andy Murray had it right, in that classic Scottish way. Bad for tennis, bad for Australia, bad for Djokovic. We'll see how this we'll see how this goes, but it's going to be, I think it's going to be really difficult.
Yeah.
And I think the reason for that is I think it's really tough for the Australians, if you like, to give Djokovic a pass when they have had some of the world's longest lockdowns. They've got 90% vaccination. Look, Djokovic clearly says that he thought that he had his visa, that he had a right to be there because he caught COVID in the past. Equally, of course, these allegations that he didn't declare, for example, some foreign travel in the 14 days before he headed to Australia. He blames his team. I mean, it's a mess, right? It's just a mess.
And everybody's got an opinion about it. You know, the Serbian president, you know, they love Djokovic. The Serbian president was out today criticizing this whole visa decision. The sports minister likened it to harassment. I have to tell you, Keir, and can I just be real with you for a second here? There may be some people going, are you really leading the show with this story tonight? But here's why, right? And I think we framed it right at the top. He really is, Keir. There is no matter if you're here in America, over where you are overseas, there is so much tension in a lot of these places between government mandates and requirements to try to fight the pandemic and people who are, you know, wanting to preserve their individual liberties or freedoms, right? Whatever you may think of their decision on that front.
Yeah.
Novak Djokovic has become the face of this around the world. This is global news, right? He is an illustration of this tension point here. And that's what makes this, I think, really important and really interesting.
Yeah, look, I remember 2 years ago when the pandemic started, saying on air multiple times, you're going to see this COVID, this pandemic, shake global politics. You're going to see it upend geopolitics. You're going to see different countries react in different ways and face different challenges. Australia is really interesting, you know, Hallie, because Australia, and listen, I have friends, Aussie friends, here in the UK, for example. Australia has been incredibly tough. Those friends haven't gone home for 2 years. Australian passport holders not going home, not seeing their families for years because Australia has been so tough about it. So when you go and talk to the Australian people, they are divided, and there is a large number of them, and you're going to hear some speak now. You're going to hear a large number of them who support the decision of the Australian government. Take a listen.
I understand government, but the way how they've done it is, in my opinion, is not right.
I think he's kind of very arrogant to think that he's the only player, or virtually the only player, that can come in without the right criteria.
Laurie will play a different person.
Yeah.
So it's good news for the fans that we support, isn't it?
So, you know, Hallie, honestly, there is a big chunk of politics in this. As I said, there is an election coming in Australia. You can't unpick the two. But for some Australians, many, as you heard there are some basic principles here that are more than just tennis, more than just sport.
Keir Simmons, I know we may get some more developments on this sometime, maybe the next hour or so. We'll look for you for any updates. Thank you, friend. I know you're a long-time listener, first-time leader. Appreciate it. Tonight, the U.S. says Moscow, when we talk about Russia, is taking steps that might end up in all-out war. That's the serious warning coming from the U.S. after meetings all across Europe this week aimed at trying to get Russia to back its troops away from the Ukrainian border. Well, guess what we're learning now? Guess what U.S. intel shows now? That the Kremlin may be setting itself up to launch an attack on its own forces and then try and blame Ukraine about it. Here's the White House press secretary, Jen Psaki. She says the U.S. thinks that plan is already happening.
We have information that indicates Russia has already pre-positioned a group of operatives to conduct a false flag operation in eastern Ukraine.
Again, basically, Russian saboteurs going into Ukraine to stage an attack on Russia so they have a pretext to then invade. A U.S. official is also telling us here at NBC News that Russians are taking the fight online, too, by trying to, quote, sow divisions on social media and justify some kind of an intervention or attack. Look at this. Ukraine says 70 government sites got hit with a cyber attack overnight. And the cyber attack displayed a rather ominous message: be afraid and expect the worst. You also see the Ukrainian flag in the top right of the message with a line crossed through it. Carol Lee is following all of this from the White House. And it's a lot, Carol, right? And let me sort of start with the idea that this is still kind of a guessing game by the Biden administration in many ways. They're not in Putin's head. They don't know what Vladimir Putin necessarily wants to do, but they're looking at this intel showing a possible false flag operation. And I think the concern level is really high.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Hallie. They don't have a clue of what Putin is going to do. Obviously, they can guess. He's amassed tens of thousands of troops on the border, and they're prepared for if he crosses the border and invades Ukraine again, but they don't know. And so what you're seeing here is them try to telegraph publicly, listen, this is, you know this, you covered the White House, they don't release intelligence, they don't declassify things just for no reason. And so the reason why they're doing this is because they want to get ahead of it, because if Russia were to do something like this, which is basically create a fake reason for them to invade Ukraine, the White House wants to have laid down a marker publicly and said that a warning that they were going to do this, so people don't fall for it. So that's what they're doing here, and but generally it's really a game of chicken. They don't know exactly what Russia is going to do and when, and so they're sort of watching and doing what they can, and part of that is declassifying intelligence and going public with it.
You also got, from the Ukrainian perspective, you had President Zelensky today of Ukraine saying, hey, let's do three-way talks. Let's all chat, right? Presidents Biden, Putin, Zelensky, get everybody at the table to have a discussion. I know that you and our colleagues at the White House team have heard from White House officials about this, but so far it seems kind of non-committal, of course, right?
Yeah, it's non-committal. And, people observing this are like, why isn't Ukraine in talks about Ukraine? And it's a good question because you would think they would be at the table, but it's largely European and U.S. driven with the Russians. And so this proposal, the Ukrainians are saying the U.S. is open to it, and they're waiting to hear from Russia. I'll just read you part of a statement from a White House official who said, we're consulting with allies and partners, including Ukraine, to determine next steps. They're also talking to Russia. And so you see they're trying to sort of say they're open to it, but not commit to it, because it's not really something that's necessarily likely to happen. And everything is so sensitive right now that they're just playing playing things very cautiously.
There's also this piece of it. Listen, this is one of those topics that I think most people go, Nord Stream 2, this pipeline, what? Like, I don't care. It doesn't affect my life. It actually does affect American diplomacy, right? We're talking about this proposal from Senator Ted Cruz to sanction, Nord Stream 2. Some Democrats up for re-election support that. The Biden administration is now coming out against that. The president's saying now is not the right time. Explain to people why this is important and why this matters, Carol.
It matters because this is leverage. This is part of the United States' leverage right now with Russia. The administration doesn't have much. One of the things they're threatening to do, and they say that Europeans are united on this, particularly Germany, is if Russia were to cross the border and invade Ukraine, that they would turn that oil pipeline off. And so the gas doesn't flow and Russia doesn't get a lot of money. And so if you were to then step in the middle of all of this, and from the administration's perspective, and issue these sanctions, then that takes away their leverage, and they really don't have anything to argue over or hold over the Russians in order to get them to do what the U.S. wants them to do, which is back off and de-escalate. The other thing I'd say, Hallie, is that this is not the only Russia sanctions bill in Congress, and I think what you're seeing is, and you'll increasingly see this is going to be a campaign issue. I mean, the administration says that Ted Cruz's bill is not serious. He was using it, it was part of an agreement to let go of, release some holds on some of President Biden's nominations, but there are other bills, including ones supported by Democrats, and so being tough on Russia is going to be an issue for Democrats and Republicans going forward and heading into the midterms.
Carol Lee, nobody's better than you at explaining why things matter when it comes to the political realm. You're the best. Thank you. Happy Friday.
Thanks, Hallie.
Happy Friday. Keep an eye on that story. We're also watching something else that happened right before we came on the air. We found out that these two guys hit with seditious conspiracy. Sorry, I tripped over it because it's not a word I say a lot. Seditious conspiracy. It's the first time that we've seen this charge from the Justice Department, right? And now we've found out that Stewart Rhodes, one of the people charged, is going to be behind bars for at least a week. Basically, the Department of Justice is saying they helped organize the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Let me show you one of these guys, Stewart Rhodes. He was in a Texas courthouse, not even 2 hours ago. He's the leader of the Oath Keepers. They're a far-right militia group. We've talked about them on this show. Rhodes is one of 11 people who was arrested on that charge. And just a couple of minutes ago, his lawyers turned around some pretty quick reaction to that hearing. Watch.
Says he's not guilty. Wants to fight the charges.
He intends to fight these charges until the very, very end.
Not shocking, right? Maybe it would have been bigger news if the lawyers came out and said the opposite. We are hearing from Rhodes' ex-wife. She's speaking to our Tom Winter, essentially to kind of tell off her ex-husband, Tasha Adams, saying of Rhodes, quote, what he truly, truly believes in himself is as a historical figure. The militant behavior, she says, is about fulfilling his own mythology. Pete Williams is here to talk about this. So, Pete, any other info we're getting in from not just this hearing on Stewart Rhodes? There was another one actually involving somebody else. Tell us about it.
So for both of them, they were initial appearances. These are very short hearings. They were formally notified of the charges, and in both cases, the magistrate judges set detention hearings for next Thursday. So both of them will be back in court, and the judge will then decide whether they'll be held pending trial. My guess is, Hallie, that the judges probably will, because these are among the more serious charges. Now, one thing, however, for Stewart Rhodes and for Vallejo both is neither of them is charged with actually committing a violent act. Some of the people who have been ordered detained pending trial are people who have attacked police officers or damaged property in the Capitol. That's not the case with either of them, the two that had their hearings today. So we'll have to see what the magistrate judges say about whether they can be released pending trial. And, of course, ultimately they're headed here to Washington because that's where the trial for all of these Capitol riot cases will be.
Part of what has made this particular indictment with Stewart Rhodes, I think, so interesting, Pete, as you well know, is that we're getting a sense of the communications that he was having, right? Some of those text messages, some of the way he was talking to his, fellow militia members here. Twice in these texts, he calls the riot a civil war. He also points out how close some of the rioters were to sitting senators, right, just a few hundred feet away. But here's the thing about seditious conspiracy. It's only really been used successfully against Puerto Rican nationalists, the people who planned the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. You know the DOJ way better than I do, but you have to look at this and think, or maybe you don't, if they're breaking this charge out, they have to think they have a case, right? Or am I totally wrong on that?
Oh no, they wouldn't have filed it if they didn't think they had a chance. There's a principle of federal prosecution that you can't bring a charge in the federal government unless you think you have a good chance of getting a conviction. You have to have more than a 50-50 chance, you think. So yes, obviously the government is confident in the case. You're right, seditious conspiracy is a seldom used charge. But it's been pretty clear from the beginning that the government has always said that that was something they were considering in this case. So I don't think we should be surprised that in this Oath Keepers case they've decided to bring the charge. And you're right also to point out, I think, that the backbone of this new indictment, remember, this is 11 people in this seditious conspiracy count. 9 of them had previously been charged on a different conspiracy charge, 9 accused of being Oath Keepers. So this adds the 2 new ones, Stewart Rhodes and Edward Vallejo. Vallejo is accused of being behind in Ballston at a hotel, prepared to drive weapons into the district, to the Capitol if they were needed.
One of the things that is interesting here, too, is that we actually heard from Rhodes Wednesday talking about the charges on a far-right radio show. This is it.
I don't do illegal activities. I always stay on this side of the line. I know where the lines are, and it drives them crazy.
So part of what I think he's alluding to there when he says this side of the line is the fact Rhodes did not actually, it's believed, go into the Capitol building on January 6th. That's the case his lawyer is making, right? And there's still some questions here about, the spontaneity versus planning thing, right? Because I know, can I shout out your producer, Daniel Barnes, Peter, Pete Williams, because we talked yesterday, and Daniel channeled his inner Pete and said, listen, there was nothing in the indictment that said there was a plan to storm the Capitol. There was planning involved in some of the parts around it, right? But the actual storming the Capitol is still an open question.
That's been a big question all along, is did somebody have a plan in advance to storm the Capitol? Now, you do see suggestions of that in the indictment. Twice, he cites previous cases where people did storm a government building. Once, the Serbians who stormed the parliament to try to undo the election of Slobodan Milosevic. And then again, he pointed out to his followers on January 6th that some of the founding fathers stormed the Massachusetts governor's mansion. So he seemed to approvingly cite these previous cases where rioters stormed capitals to try to undo elections. There's no suggestion, though, that he was engaged in actual planning to do that. At least it's not explicit. But again, remember that the indictment that was handed down yesterday doesn't hinge on that. What it says is he egged his followers on, consistently talked about the need to have some kind of violence in Washington to try to stop the election. That's the essence of this charge.
Pete Williams, live for us in our DC newsroom. Pete, thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. We got some other breaking news just coming into us here from the CDC, which is working to clear up some of the mask confusion that's been out there over Omicron. They're now saying you can choose to wear an N95 or a KN95 mask. They're not saying you should. They're just saying you can choose to wear one if you'd like to. It comes as the White House is really trying to get a handle on this whole response to the pandemic with some, I think, important consumer news you can use, if you will, if you care about getting tests. They're announcing they're going to start giving away those 500 million rapid COVID tests for free starting next week. You can sign up starting next week. You can get up to 4 per household to start. It's going to take you a little bit of time to get them. That's against the backdrop of the uptick in cases over the past couple weeks. It's putting such a strain on hospitals. More than 80% of hospital beds are occupied in 24 states with patients who do and do not have COVID. This is a strain on resources, gang. I want to bring in Peter Alexander. Peter, let me start you on this new mask guidance from the CDC. This has been long awaited. We've talked about it on this show a lot, right? The idea that, we're seeing more officials wearing KN95s and N95 masks. We know that cloth masks do not seem to be as protective against the Omicron variant. And now some guidance from the CDC that, by my read, sort of says do what you want.
Well, so let's walk through this. First of all, this literally came out within the last 5 minutes. So this is as up to the minute as you can get on News Now.
On NBC News Now, Peter.
Exactly. That is how we roll. So let's walk you through this. First, to what you were saying about cloth masks, we have heard from the public health experts they do not work as well as the other masks. So you're always being encouraged to use the best possible mask that you can, and that you make sure you wear one that you're going to wear as often as possible and as consistently as possible with a good fit. That's the #1 priority. So for those that have the luxury to be picking and choosing what mask they wear, the CDC is now saying, they're clarifying that people can choose, as you noted, those KN95s or N95 masks, and they've now removed the concerns related to some supply chain shortages for those masks. There were concerns that there wouldn't be sufficient number of them in some healthcare settings. So that's where things stand right now. At the end of the day, it's up to the individuals, but they're removing any obstacle to sort of encouraging you and saying that you can wear these masks. Again, to be very clear, Hallie, the biggest priority for the CDC, as we've heard from Rochelle Walensky, the director, and others, is that you wear a mask that you're going to wear, that fits well, and that you're not going to be ripping off.
Yeah, don't take it off every 5 minutes. That defeats the point of wearing a mask in the first place. So masking is one piece of this. Testing is obviously another piece of this. And now the White House is giving some more details about the timeline, how you get them. Can I be honest, Peter? My mom texted me about this a couple days ago. She says, when you hear more about the new free test, let me know. For my mom, Peter, give the lowdown on what people should know.
Yeah, Ms. Jackson, this one's for you here, okay? So this is going to be rolled out with a new website the White House is launching. It's called covidtests.gov. The website will roll out on Wednesday of next week, January 19th. They're also going to have a phone number, a phone line that they provide as well. They haven't announced that yet. And as you said in the introduction here, Hallie, they're going to be providing 4 tests per household of these at-home rapid tests for free. So no matter how many people live in your house, you are eligible to get 4 of them. They say they're going to be sent through the Postal Service and that it will likely take 7 to 12 days. They estimate 7 to 12 days from the ordering of the masks until you get them, which is significant because if you're talking the 19th and you add 7 to 12 days, a lot of people, if they start right then, are not going to be getting them until the end of the month or maybe even into February. The other item that they want to make note of is this commitment to equity that's been a priority for the Biden administration. They say they're going to prioritize households that face the highest social vulnerabilities, the vulnerabilities to COVID-19. They didn't communicate exactly how that will work in practice, but it does relate to their effort to make sure those people who need these masks have that access.
Of course, must be said, there are people who are looking for tests now, right? There are people who need tests now for childcare, for work purposes, et cetera. So, 7 to 12 days on top of starting next Wednesday, as that's down the road a bit.
Well, the Omicron surge, as you know better than anybody, is well underway, right? So the idea that these are arriving in February is one of the real political questions the White House has been trying to fend off.
There's also another political question that I'm fascinated by, Peter, because it really gets to this, what we talked about at the very top of the show, as I'm sure you watched, which is this tension between, government officials trying to fight the pandemic and states, right, or people who are pushing back against that. There's the Treasury Department that's now telling Arizona officials they're going to actually try to pull back some of the pandemic help or maybe withhold some money if Arizona doesn't change some of the programs that undercut mask requirements in schools. This is interesting and could lead to more down the road, no?
Yeah, that's right, especially as it relates to a lot of those, in many cases, Republican, I think in all cases for the sake of this, Republican-led states right here. This is related to the Republican governor, Doug Ducey in Arizona, who have been using, in the eyes of the Biden administration, the COVID relief funds they received for unauthorized purposes. Arizona's gotten about half, $2.1 billion of the $4.2 billion that they had been promised. I'm going to browse my notes to make sure I get this right, but what the frustration is for the administration, why they are threatening to pull this money back right now, is because a series of education programs. And what these programs do in particular is they do sort of undercut a school mask requirement that some districts, or mask requirements that some districts in that state have put in place. One of them up to $1,800 in additional money per student in public and charter schools. It would provide them the ability to take that money and basically go elsewhere, and it would undercut some of the schools that have those requirements in place. The other one is vouchers up to $7,000 to help poor families leave districts that require face covering. So the White House's argument here, the administration's argument here, is this is not the way this is supposed to work. We are trying to encourage that people take these precautions, not to discourage it.
Not to put you on the spot, do you have any sense from sources that you talked to there at the White House that this could be a tactic that they use against more of these Republican-led states?
Well, it's interesting you raise that, obviously, given the news we saw over the last 24 hours with the Supreme Court decision about the vaccine and test mandate there. The court basically said those health care centers, they can keep enforcing it, but that businesses of 100 individuals or more, they would not be able to, right? And that really took out one of the key tools the White House was hoping to use here to try to raise the number of eligible Americans. 63% of Americans eligible right now have been vaccinated. They were trying to push that number up. So they've been looking for unique tools to do this. This appears to be another one of those ways to try to put pressure on those states that have been pushing back.
Peter Alexander on a Friday night for us at the White House. Peter, thank you.
Well,
coming up here on the show. Okay, thanks, Peter. Coming up, North Korea firing off some more test missiles for the third time this month. Why? They're not happy with the Biden administration and some new sanctions. We're going to get into it after the break. With the Beijing Olympics just a month away and a presidential election in South Korea in March, you would think those countries would be getting the attention. But no. In that region, it's North Korea. Why? Because we're learning that North Korea used a railway-borne missile in its test launch today, according to its state media. You might be thinking, well, what in the world is that? It's part of a new system designed as a potential counterstrike to what the country classifies as any forces that threaten them. South Korea says that's one of two missiles the North fired today. Their third weapons launch this month alone. We're not even 2 weeks into this month. North Korea is putting the blame on the U.S., basically saying, well, the U.S. started it, apparently reacting to these new sanctions from the Biden administration over those original missile tests that North Korea started. And at the same time as all this is going down, we're also learning this. North Korea stole a record $400 million in cryptocurrency last year. Yeah. They apparently, according to researchers, broke into at least 7 crypto exchanges, laundered the money, and then the UN has said North Korea is using stolen money to pay for the missile programs we're talking about. Matt Bradley joins me now. Matt, let me bring you in on this because, listen, it's a lot of money they got from stealing crypto, right? Before that, they relied on hackers getting into financial institutions around the world to steal money. It's kind of a change in strategy for them.
Yeah, I mean, it is and it isn't. I mean, the fact is that they're still going after financial institutions. They're still going after conventional banks. The hackers have not given up their conventional mission. But really what this says, if anything at all, is it just shows the arrival of cryptocurrency. And all the crypto bros are going to agree with me that this is just another metric of how great crypto is.
Do not pander to the crypto bros on this show, Matt, okay? There's enough pandering to the crypto bros that happen.
Never. But the fact is that it just goes to show that crypto is making a lot of money. The rise in the value of crypto means it's worth stealing. That's what happens when you have something that's of value. And also the exposure of these so-called hot wallets, and that's another big issue. These hot wallets are exposed to the internet. They're the medium of exchange. They're allowed to be traded. It's like carrying your cash on hand. You're asking to be mugged, and that's exactly what's happening here. And that's why a lot of crypto exchanges are saying, move your money, once you've made your massive wealth off of crypto, move it from a hot wallet into a cold wallet, which is not as connected to the internet. And that's why we're starting to see all of these North Korean hackers starting to move against crypto just because it makes financial sense.
And let's get to the reason why this matters, right? Is because it seems like they're using that money to then pay for this missiles. These missile launches, the ballistic weapons programs here, according to organizations. Since September, they've done 7 missile tests, including the one today. As we said, a bunch just this month alone. Talk through the end game, right? Because North Korea does this every so often. They make a lot of noise, then things kind of calm down, then they make a lot of noise again. How do you see this playing out?
I don't know the end game, Hallie, if I'm going to be honest with you. I mean, they were doing this during the Trump administration when Trump was trying to stoke them, when he was, trying to, basically calling names.
Sure, but Matt, the end game, right, is to get the world's attention.
So, I mean, it's still going on.
Don't you think? The end game is to get the world's attention, is to try to be a power on the world stage. I mean, that's what North Korea wants. They're totally incapable of that right now.
They simply don't want to be another sort of regional power or someone who's just simply somewhat frightening as opposed to totally deadly. And, this is a big issue for the North Koreans. They care a lot about their stature, about how many countries in the world fear them. But, we can also look at their official explanation, which isn't necessarily totally out of line. They want to test their weapons. They have a very unsophisticated military, and they want to be able to test these weapons in order to use them. And this railway example of, launching a missile off of a railway, well, this has been used by Western forces for quite a while, for decades. And so to be able to use that, to be able to test that in a combat-like scenario, they have to be able to do that. So in a way, yes, they are trying to stoke the attention and trying to get people to notice them. But they really are, Hallie, trying to test their weapons.
Matt Bradley, live first there, overseas. Matt, thank you for that breakdown. Appreciate it. South Dakota's Republican governor rolling out a new ad targeting transgender student athletes. And she's up for re-election this year. Do you think those two things are probably related? Yeah, we're talking about that in tonight's original. Plus, Boris Johnson and his team, oh man, another party. And this time, the timing is going to shock you. After the break. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, the Supreme Court says it'll hear an appeal from a former Washington State high school football coach who was suspended for refusing to stop praying on the field after games. He says his First Amendment rights were violated when he lost his job. That's one we'll be watching in Washington. Number 2, Boris Johnson's office is apologizing again for a party again, this time in an apology that went right to the Queen. Turns out the British PM's office held a staff party the night before Prince Philip's funeral last year. Prince Philip, of course, was Queen Elizabeth's husband. You probably remember the pictures of Queen Elizabeth by herself. Besides being a time of national mourning, staff were also partying when gathering indoors was banned because of COVID. Johnson himself wasn't there. He called the party, his spokesman did, deeply regrettable. Number 3, Alec Baldwin has finally turned over his phone to the officers investigating the Rust shooting. This comes nearly a month after detectives in New Mexico got a search warrant for that phone. Number 4, today a federal judge ordered notorious pharma bro Martin Shkreli, remember him? He's now banned for life from the pharmaceutical industry. He also has to return nearly $65 million in money he earned from jacking up the price of the life-saving drug Daraprim. Number 5, in the UK, people working on a new high-speed train network are finding a ton of cool old stuff. Archaeologists say they found this ancient wood figure believed to date back 2,000 years to the Roman period. Check it out. They're calling this discovery extremely rare. Tonight, you've got 64 million people under some kind of winter weather alert, and it might get worse. You've got Virginia and North Carolina already declaring states of emergency. The storm's hitting the Midwest already, where honestly it looks kind of like a winter wonderland out there in Minnesota. They're expecting to get anywhere from 6 to 10 inches of snow in the southern part of the state before the system moves on. And while it looks rather lovely at the moment, don't let that fool you. The storm's headed east, bringing with it snow, sleet, wind chills that will probably cause problems on the road, ice that could be a problem for power lines and power outages all the way through Monday. I'm sure you'll hear more about that over the weekend. In other news, Google and Facebook tonight are being accused of cutting an unfair ad deal. You've got 16 states and Puerto Rico who say that Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg and Google CEO Sundar Pichai knew about the 2018 deal that essentially gave Facebook special privileges on Google's ad platform. It's part of an amended antitrust complaint against Google. Google denies the claims, calling the characterization of the arrangement with Facebook inaccurate. The company plans on asking a judge to dismiss the case next week. Danny Ceballos joins me to explain this. Danny, I think this is interesting to people because these are companies we know, right? We know Facebook, we know Google, and it seems like the central allegation here is that Google gave Facebook like a sweet deal unfairly.
Yes, and in addition, Facebook and Google allegedly engaged in anti-competitive behavior. We have a bedrock rule in the United States that companies can't engage in cartel behavior. They can't collude to essentially drive up prices artificially or benefit themselves in an unfair way. Federal law requires giant companies like this to essentially play fairly. And that's what these state attorney generals are alleging, is that Google gave choice deals to Facebook and engaged otherwise in anti-competitive behavior in violation of what are called antitrust laws.
Talk to me about the defense, right, for both Meta, Facebook's parent company, and then Google here. They're both saying, as we just said, that the characterizations of the deal is incorrect. You are, as you often like to point out on the show, a defense attorney. What's the deal?
If I put my defense attorney hat on, the way they're going to approach this is probably the same way most antitrust defendants respond, which is we weren't colluding. We're engaging in good old-fashioned red meat, American, wave the flag competition, not anti-competitive behavior. Rather, we were entering into deals, and those deals may have benefited us, but they didn't prevent anyone else from making money. They may argue that all these bids that they allegedly doctored were not doctored at all. That, in fact, if they are selling these ads for the bidded amount and the bid wins, then that's capitalism at its finest. That's what I expect them to argue, that what they did not fall within the ambit of antitrust law, but was just good old-fashioned capitalism.
Okay, let's say that argument doesn't fly, right? What kind of consequences are these companies looking at if, in fact, this case does not go their way? Like, will we notice a difference?
You may and you may not. I mean, to the extent that they're asking for Google to stop doing this kind of fix on the bidding that is alleged in the complaint, that may not be something that we as end consumers really notice. I mean, our existence with, say, Facebook is we click on it and we see pictures of our friends. Our existence in Google is we Google things and we see ads. Now, what ads we see is part of an insanely complex algorithm or program or whatever they do to target us, and that's where they make a lot of their money. So might we see a difference in the ad that we might normally expect to see? Maybe, but I think this may have greater implications, financial implications, or injunctive relief, the kind that a court might tell Google to knock it off.
Danny Ceballos, thank you so much, as always, for breaking it down in such an easy way to understand. Appreciate it. Now, to tonight's original, with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. And on this one, with the midterm elections finally now happening this year, right, 2022, you've got some Republicans fanning the flames of culture war in hopes of having a positive turnout in elections. And some are looking even further past the midterms. For South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, we're talking about targeting transgender kids. The governor releasing an ad on national primetime TV overnight, promoting a bill she introduced last month to prevent trans girls from playing on any female sports teams at schools. It's happening as big sports organizations like the International Olympic Committee and others are actually updating their guidelines to be more inclusive of transgender and non-binary athletes. So what's the deal here? Maura Barrett is following this one. Watch.
In South Dakota, only girls play girls' sports. Why? Because of Governor Kristi Noem's leadership.
South Dakota's Republican governor in a new national ad betting on her 2022 re-election campaign, targeting transgender athletes and promoting a bill banning trans girls from playing sports in school.
Now, Governor Noem has a bill that will give South Dakota the strongest law in the nation protecting female sports.
It's an about-face for the incumbent governor. Back in March, she vetoed a similar bill that would have limited trans girls and women from competing in female sports leagues. She's running on the idea of less government, more freedom, according to her website, and joins a group of conservative Republican leaders who oppose trans rights.
Athletic teams or sports that are designated for females are open to females, and we're going to go based off biology, not based off ideology.
We all know what an absolute advantage boys would have playing against girls.
In 2021, 35 bills were filed in state legislatures to exclude transgender youth from competing in athletics. Plus, 7 more bills already introduced this year, working to limit trans and non-binary youth rights. 9 states enacted those laws, while South Dakota's was done by executive order. In an email to NBC News, a Republican South Dakota state representative supported NOEM, writing, "It is unfortunate that we see this as removing the rights of any people. If competitive sports were made to be fair, there is a place for everyone to compete with the biology they were born with." The ACLU, though, sees a detrimental impact.
Understanding the impact that will have on transgender kids and the people who love them is honestly, it's devastating. Even if these bills don't pass, it still has a huge effect on trans kids. To know that their state representatives, they're not supporting them, they're instead attacking them.
JAYA NAGARAJAN-SWENSON, a non-binary student athlete on their school's rowing team and who has been closely following this legislation around the country, says they would be ready to leave their sport over what they call a polarizing issue.
When you see something like this happen, how does it make you feel?
Joining athletics was a really big part of my life. And I don't know if I would have done it if I had been seeing all of this. Like seeing something that so clearly says, oh, like you're not really welcome here, but we're also not really going to talk about it. And it's going to be all of this, like these veiled sort of threats against you as a person. It makes it so easy to just get really dangerous into this like far wave of transphobia.
Maura Barrett is joining us now live to get into a little bit more on this. Maura, I think what's interesting here is sentiment in the country. When you look at some of the polling that's been out in just the past year from PBS, for example, most Americans actually support trans sports, right? They support people who are transgender playing on the sports teams of their gender. But that's not what we're hearing from some of these states that, as you're reporting on, are trying to change the laws around this.
Right, and the big picture here, Hallie, is that a lot of the sentiment around how Americans feel about transgender rights in general has changed because more and more people are comfortable with coming out as trans, and that really depends on your age range, right? It's become more common in your and my lifetime, and so younger Americans, this Gallup poll finds, younger Americans, more than half of them know someone who's transgender, so they have more empathy, they're more accepting of what these transgender people want to be living, how they want to be living and what they want to be doing and the rights that they want to have. And so on the other hand, though, if you look at an older age range that hasn't had this in their lives as much, basically some Americans are just not ready to question these norms or even to have form an opinion about it. So I wanted to take a look at this, how the numbers are actually broken down with this Gallup poll after seeing all of what happened in 2021. A majority of Americans still do think that people should be playing on a team that matches their gender at birth at 62%. So that's changed over time. It's gotten lower. But when you look at the number of Republicans that support it, that's at 86%. And so bigger picture here, Kristi Noem didn't put out a national ad just to target South Dakota voters, right? This is becoming a larger election issue, one that we're seeing become more of a trend with Republicans. And it's something to watch going into these midterm elections, Hallie.
Maura Barrett, live for us on that. Maura, thank you so much for your reporting. Appreciate that. Coming up here on the show, we're looking into how businesses are left trying to figure out how they'll move forward with protecting employees after that major Supreme Court ruling just 24 hours ago. We've got Jake Ward on tap for that. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. Out of our Midwest Bureau, we told you a case we've been following. We've told you about this Illinois judge, right, who's made a lot of people angry by reversing teenager Drew Clinton's rape conviction. He let him go after 148 days. That judge has now been removed from handling criminal cases because of all the outrage. Judge Robert Adrian will now just hear probate and civil cases and some other small claims. From our West Coast Bureau, a new and frankly terrifying perspective on the Marshall fire in Colorado last month. Look at this body cam video from first responders who raced in to evacuate people. What you're looking at right now is one deputy who is basically frantically running door to door. He's ringing doorbells, trying to get people out, trying to get people to pack bags, grab their pets, grab their stuff. Look at that pup. That fire was the most destructive in Colorado history. That body cam video is really something. And finally, from our Northeast Bureau, a story that crosses state and international borders. Hold on to your hats here. A Rhode Island man reported dead 2 years ago while facing criminal charges in multiple states has been found alive and arrested in Scotland. Nicholas Rossi has been wanted in connections with allegations of 2008 sex assault in Utah and a 2018 attack in Ohio. Officials say he faked his death to try to get out of consequences here, and that they only found him, listen to this twist, because he was in the hospital overseas with COVID. Some international agencies are working to extradite him back to the U.S. So businesses are now trying to figure out at this point what to do when it comes to requiring vaccinations for their workers. That's after the Supreme Court said federal government officials, President Biden, the White House, cannot force companies to do it. You remember, we covered that 24 hours ago. So here we are 24 hours after that ruling, looking at a kind of patchwork of plans. Here's a sampling. You've got Meta, the parent company of Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. CVS and Lyft today is telling NBC News the decision does not affect their company's current policy. They require employees to be vaccinated. Nothing changes. But Macy's, which just started requesting employee vaccination status this month, said the company is now evaluating this development. Jake Ward joins me now. Jake, what's interesting here, the Supreme Court didn't say companies can't ask employees to get vaccinated, right, or test. Like, companies can do that if they want, but there's no mandate that they have to coming down from the federal government. How are you seeing this play out in the business world?
Well, business leaders are very split across the country, Hallie. You have, for instance, the United Federation of Independent Businesses, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, saying that they're excited that this mandate went away. They had called the mandate a gut punch to small businesses. But then you have the CEO of the company I'm standing in front of right now, Columbia Sportswear, which owns Mountain Hardwear, whose corporate headquarters is here. This place that I'm standing exemplifies the complications that these businesses now face. So this company, its corporate headquarters employees are required to be vaccinated by the parent company. But the retail workers on the other side of the building are not. And across the country, you have a patchwork of state and local regulations that make it possible or impossible to impose a mandate locally. Plus, you have the possibility that workers may leave that job and go off to another one that does not have a mandate. And that is why the CEO told us, normally, I wouldn't want the federal government involved in my business, but in this particular case, he says that he desperately wanted the vaccine mandate so that everyone could be healthy and so that the playing field could be level, Hallie.
Some of these companies have had mandates in effect, for, as you point out, for like a while now, right? And some economists you talked to said it actually makes good business sense once the vaccines came online. Explain what they mean by that and why.
Well, what they essentially are pointing out is that their data shows, for one thing, the COVID pandemic has fallen, of course, unequally on people in the United States. In fact, I talked yesterday to a Boston University professor, Julia Raifman, who told me that, in fact, people who earn less than $25,000 at a company are 4 times more likely to get COVID and miss a week of work as a result, as compared to people who make $100,000 at that company. To see that kind of extraordinary difference, and you have to think that those people also in that 25,000 and under, that's the hospital workers, that is teachers, that is waiters, that is the, heroes, the frontline essential workers that we have depended on to get through this. Those people are getting a much more unequal set of results from COVID. And so this mandate made economic sense because it kept those people healthy enough, in theory, to be able to work, for the society to function. And now that we're facing a patchwork of laws, the possibility that some companies will not require a vaccine, that, of course, will make it a much more unequal playing field again.
It's super interesting to hear the sort of business perspective behind this. Jake Ward, thank you so much. Appreciate it. And have a great weekend to all of you. We're going to have right here Monday, same time, same place. Love that you're with us. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.